So hi everyone, for those that don't know, I'm Jon Lamastra. I run Lamastra Farms. We're based out of Greenbrier County. We're a relatively small operation. We came here and had very limited, budget. So we had a limited budget as far as, getting land. So we don't have a whole lot of land, so we have what we call a micro farm. We're under 2 acres, but we're able to produce lots of food. Half of it's wooded. And so most people would tell me I can't farm, but as you're all here, you already know there's huge opportunities in forest farming. My main angle was with fungi. I don't have a whole lot of information about ginseng or golden seal. I did start my ramp patches, and those have transplanted very nicely, so that's great. But my focus was on things that don't require a lot of space, and to utilize the woods that I do have. So we do garden as well a little bit, but our main focus was mushrooms because it gave us a way into our farmers markets where we weren't in competition with anyone else. For the most part, most farms focus on just about the same things. I mean, some people might specialize in cattle or some people might specialize in pork, but as far as produce goes, everyone pretty much has the same thing. So instead of just being another number and kind of like fading to the background, we decided to go a route that, let us be unique. And it's a huge opportunity for anyone really. I mean, you could design a project for an urban setup, but I think it's best to keep it more natural. As I was telling some of the other gentlemen, we do a little bit of everything. We cultivate mushrooms every way that you can possibly cultivate mushrooms, both indoors and outdoors. Both have strengths, both have weaknesses, and I think it's just the best way to get an all-around variety of production. So, if we were working specifically indoors with specialized blocks like this, it's more work and you get mushrooms a lot faster. That's why most people go this route and they line shelving with these blocks and they're pumping out as much quantity as possible. But at the same time, we're also doing, say, log production, like shiitake log cultivation has been done for thousands of years in Japan and China. And it's one that I think still holds fast today because, once you do the initial setup work of inoculating your logs, it's super hands-off. You leave these logs outside. Most of the time they're getting most of the moisture that they need from rain or snow. Occasionally during the hottest parts of the summer you might have to water them just to make sure that they don't dry out, because mycelium is a 1-cell thick organism, so it needs almost constant contact with moisture, otherwise it will dry up. And initially it won't die. It can dry up, be rehydrated, and come back and flourish. But too long of being dried out and it's not going to last. But it gives you a very hands-off approach, and it's also way more long-term. So with the bags, say for shiitake in general, or specifically, I can get shiitakes on blocks within about 4 months, based on the colonization time of the block and everything. However, if you're doing logs, it typically takes 1 to 2 years before those logs will start fruiting, which turns off a lot of people because it's a long wait and they don't really have the patience for it. But it pays off in the long run, because then that same log will keep producing for years depending on the size of the log that you chose. So I think it's beneficial to incorporate as much as possible, but at the same time you don't have to do that like me. If you have a certain cultivation method that you feel like fits you best, whether it's logs so it can be more hands-off, or whether it's blocks so you can do it inside, any way is good. But I recommend trying, more than one, because then you might get a kind of feel for which fits you best. So today we're going to be talking about forest farming with fungi. And we're going to start on log cultivation. Log cultivation is probably the most well-known cultivation method. It's been done for thousands of years, like I said. So the logs are essentially inoculated using plug spawn or sawdust spawn. I prefer plug spawn. Plug spawn is wooden dowels that have been inoculated with the mushroom mycelium, and then you wait for it to colonize. So then when you have your logs, you drill holes, you tap the plugs into them, and then you seal them with wax. And sealing them with wax keeps moisture in, and it helps keep out competitor fungi. So it's a twofold reason for doing that. So I prefer plug spawn, and like I said, it's either purchased or created ahead of the project date. You select your tree, the proper tree based on the mushroom type. Every mushroom has a tree type that it prefers. Otherwise, if you're working on proper woodland management, if you have a certain tree that needs to come down, then you just match it to the mushroom that prefers that tree. But you fell your tree, with purpose, the sole purpose of doing it. So that way you have the best chance of success based on, you're trying to avoid competitor fungi already being in it. So I don't recommend using old logs. Your best bet is to fell the tree, and you wait 2 weeks for the natural antifungal properties of the tree to leach out. And then at that point, you're going to want to inoculate within a month of felling. So typically you're waiting 2 weeks, and then within the next 2 weeks you want to inoculate. That gives you the best chance of success against competitor fungi.
Can multiple fungi live in a log?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah, so I've had several times where I inoculated a log with, say, shiitake. And then within the first year or so, because it typically takes like 2 years for a shiitake log to start producing. Usually after that first year, I'll get some stray ones that have some oysters that'll pop on it or something like that. And I know it wasn't a mix-up of spawn, because we tracked the spawn from liquid culture through brain spawn, through plug spawn, all the way to it getting inoculated. And all that is it picked up wild spores from somewhere else, and they're trying to colonize. So they're essentially fighting for colonization of that space. But typically, the amount of spawn that we use and the time that's already passed, the shiitake's already established. So the oyster will start and fruit because it realizes it's not going to be a match for it, and so it's trying to send spores off somewhere else. So yeah, but I've even had logs that had like 3 species on it at once. Like I had one that was shiitake, a wild oyster that wasn't my strains, and turkey tail.
So they can't all continue to flush over the course of years?
No, they will meet, compete, and the winner will take over.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
Winner takes all.
Exactly. Yeah. And depending on the mushroom, some mushroom types are more aggressive than another. So say if you inoculated something with oyster and then it picks up a wild spore from somewhere else, a lot of times the oyster will win. The oyster is very aggressive. It'll meet, compete, and kick it out.
John, Will said that he left the HDMI on that table.
Oh, sweet.
There we go.
Well, wasn't that easy?
I just needed a little exercise. It's good.
Yeah, I heard that. Well, wasn't that easy?
Well, you guys need to carry a walk and talk.
I know.
Why didn't you just say
Lesson
so?
learned.
I mean, to be fair, Will could have blessed us with his presence a little longer, but...
Run out.
Hey!
There we go.
Alright, how's that? Now I can get the heck out the way. Alright, so now the typical process with the log cultivation, depending on the size of your plug spawn, it'll typically say, or if you're making it, you'll know by what you order, whether or not it's like a 5/16 or whatever width it is. So you're going to match the drill bit to the dowel size. I like to drill holes in a diamond pattern on the bark surface of the log, meaning I'll do a row of holes down the length of the log. Typical spacing is 6 inches. I do 4. Because of that, I get more spawn into the log, which gives me faster colonization time and more chance for success. So like I said, if something else does come in and try to invade the space, it's already established and in such quantity that it's not going to make it. So it just gives you the best chance of success. So I'll do my 1 row down the length of the log, and then I'll stagger the holes. So that way when you look at it, it creates a diamond pattern. And that just gives you good spacing, because a lot of times the mushrooms will push out first from where you put in your spawn. But then after it's fully colonized underneath the bark surface, it can push out from any crack that it finds. And nothing is too hard or too strong for a mushroom, because they have enough of hydraulic pressure to push through asphalt, concrete, etc. So the bark is nothing to it. It'll just find a way to get out, and it'll push right out. So now, once you've drilled your holes, you're going to tap one inoculated dowel into each hole with a hammer or mallet. I prefer a rubber mallet, just so it's not busting up the dowel. You'll seal it with wax to prevent moisture loss and contamination by competitor fungi. Now, you can use just about any kind of wax. I've seen all the way from the low budget to the high budget. Some people use, general candle making wax. Some people recommend cheese wax. I think cheese wax probably does the best job. Some people like to take a more natural approach and use beeswax. The only problem with that is that you have that log outside and bees will come steal the wax back. So, like I'm with it, I understand the whole natural thing, and I've done it before, but you can watch where the bees will come and take that wax and use it in their hive. Yes, sir.
I've seen folks just not seal too. Do you ever do that?
I don't, just because, everything I read said go ahead and do it to mitigate moisture loss and prevent, or at least try to mitigate competition, fungi. But as long as you have a tight seal on it, I mean, if you're, you matched up your drill bit to your dowel, it's going to have a nice snug fit. Probably not crazy. It's just you're always trying to get your best possible chance of success through mitigation. Like technically, I could grab a jar of grain spawn and I could throw it somewhere and it might grow. But it's not the best way to try to be successful,
Food for your labor.
Yeah, exactly. Because I mean, there's a lot of work that goes into these processes. It's not hard to the point where, I don't think, certain people can do it. Anybody can do it. I'm not a mycologist. I'm a normal guy. I'm a citizen scientist. And, if I can do it, I think that anybody can do it. But your best bet is, going the route of best possible chance of success. Because you put all that time, effort, and money into it, you want to reap the benefits, So now for this one, we're talking specifically shiitakes. So the colonization period is typically 1 to 2 years. If you're using a more aggressive species like oyster mushrooms, they can typically fruit in 8-9 months or closer to the 1 year mark as opposed to the 2 years. But shiitake is just a slower colonizer. Yeah, so after that period of colonization, you wait the 1 to 2 years, and then you can start checking for mushroom production seasonally.
So with those log, I guess you might probably get into this, but is there a specific location that you want to put your logs?
So you want to be preferably in a shaded woodlot. All we're doing is a forced inoculation, but we're simulating if a tree fell in the forest and it received spores, but we're skipping some of those steps. Or instead of like technically you could take a spore print, scratch it off, throw it on a log, right? Because that's what they're going to do anyway. They're floating in the wind, they're going to land there, but then you have to wait for 2 like spores to find each other, to mate, create the hyphal knot, and then start growing the mycelium out, where we just skip all that and we already have the mycelium there, and we're introducing this mycelium to a substrate.
Can I ask about the dowels? Have you used those with a number of different kinds of mushrooms? Do you find that they work just as good for all kinds of different mushrooms?
Depending on what you do. So you could get pine. I suggest, if you can find them, going like a hardwood species route. Because most of these grow best on hardwoods. Some of them, like you do have mushrooms that are very picky and very specific. Like chaga, you're only going to find on birch.
And in that case, would you just do sawdust spawn because it's hard to find birch dowels, or what would you do?
I find birch dowels relatively simply. The one person that I use the most online is Woodpecker's Crafts, and it's woodpeckerscrafts.com. And they're a massive business that sells pieces and parts for crafts and stuff like that. So they have dowels for building the furniture or toys or whatever they're being used for. And they have several varieties where they have some that are pine and some that are birch and stuff like that.
Okay.
So, but if you can't find it, then yes, you can go the sawdust route. And yes, some people choose to do sawdust spawn for log inoculation, and I think there's probably a varied amount of reasons why. Like some of them probably have a lot of sawdust spawn in production anyway, so why make another item? They also have a plunger that's a specific tool for this use, where essentially you push it into your sawdust spawn and it gives you like a plug, essentially like the wooden dowel would be, and then you just put it to the hole, press the plunger, and it just pushes the sawdust spawn into the hole. So essentially it's doing the same thing. For me, I just find it's easier to do plug spawn, especially when I'm selling it to customers, because I don't have to be like, well, you also have to go get this specific tool. You know, most people have a hammer sitting around or, something like that. So
And
it's
for
just,
yourself, do you find that it's easier? Like, I'm imagining, we've used the plunger before, it's like, it's a multiple step, you gotta fill the plunger,
Right.
and then you gotta plunge, like,
I think it's
putting it down, it's a
100%
lot
easier.
faster.
100%,
Yeah.
yeah. So depending on how much I'm doing, I'll do like a quart jar. I'll typically do like a 200 count, plug spawn. If I'm using these big specialized bags, I usually do 1,000 or so.
Okay.
So it really just depends on the size of the bag for that. But I mean, at that point, you crack open a jar and you can just sit there one at a time, boom, boom, or you can line up a whole row and then boom, 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 boom. So it's so much easier for me, I think, and it just makes it so much more user friendly. And I'm not telling them, okay, well now that you bought this spawn, you also have to spend more money.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Yes, sir.
So you make your dowel, you just buy a regular dowel and then you spray it yourself, or do you?
Yeah, so essentially, when I was first looking into it, because I've always had an interest in mushrooms, but when I was first looking into it, I was looking at the kits, and kits are readily available now. They have several different companies that make the kits, and that's great. It's super user friendly. It's literally just, cut an X on the box, mist it with water a couple times a day, and typically within a week or two, depending on the species, you have mushrooms. It's a great way to have a first success and everything like that. But I'm doing my research and I see that and I'm like, yeah, but how did they make that? So I started following the steps back and it's like, oh, okay, so they had grain spawn and they took it to a substrate to make their kit, but how did they make that? And I just kept tracing it back. Well, how did they make the grain spawn? Well, they used liquid cultures.
Yeah. Are you doing agar?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
That's what I
Yeah, so agar typically is, you're going to put that in a petri dish, and that's your best possible step to go from one to another. I use agar for tissue biopsies. If I'm cloning mushrooms, like say I do a batch of mushrooms and I get, a lion's mane that's just massive, I want that. I want that uniformly. I don't want some to be small, some to be giant, so on and so forth. So I'll take that giant one, I'll take a tissue biopsy, and I'm essentially cloning that mushroom. So if I take that and I put it to agar, and it's clean, that kind of gives you a step to see and make sure that there is no contamination. So you put it to your petri plate, typically you're doing that in front of a flow hood or in a still air box, depending on low budget, high budget, and you're gonna wait to see if the mycelium's growing or if you end up with mold on the plate, and you essentially will keep taking pieces of that and putting it to another plate and keep going until you know for sure you have a 100% clean plate. From there, you're free to use it to make liquid cultures. And that's the foundation of everything, because once you have a clean liquid culture, you use that as your mother to make everything else, So you do the agar work, you make sure it's clean, you make an LC. Typically, I'll do mother LCs in a quart jar, and at that point, I'm usually doing like around 600 mil. And so that gave you, if I do 10 cc syringes, that means I just made 60 syringes, and it just expands exponentially. So you take that, yeah, right from the one jar. So it's essentially, you could go online, you could order an LC syringe, and they're relatively cheap, and you take that and you expand it. So you expand it to a bigger jar of LC, now you have the ability to have 60, but where you just have one, You take that and you can put it to grain jars. I typically do a quart Depending on what grain I'm using, I'll do either half to 3/4 full, just so that way it has room because the grains will expand. And then you will have mycelium running up the jar, as you can see on some of these. But you can use, typically 1 to 2 cc's each. I do 2. When I do 2, I get a much faster colonization rate, higher chance of success. But a 1-in-5 ratio is ideal with mushroom growing. So if I have, 1 syringe, I can use that to make 5 jars. I can use those 5 jars to make 25. Or I can put it to bigger bags where I'm doing 5-6 pounds of grain spawn, and that's 1 jar to that. But then that's the equivalent of 5 or 6 approximately.
Quick question.
Yes, ma'am.
How do you go from the agar cloning to the liquid culture?
So when you do the Petri plates, with the agar, you're essentially just going to cut out like little pizza slices, they say, or like triangles or something like that. And you can use 1 dish to do many. But typically I'll just take like 2, maybe 3 little cuts of triangles and put that to 1 jar. In doing sterile work, so you want to make sure you're either in a sterilized SAB, a still air box, or in front of a flow hood, just to mitigate any chances of competition fungi. And you just do that. Open the jar, put 2-3 slices in there, close it up, and just wait. Watch the mycelium expand throughout that nutrient broth solution.
Yes, the nutrient broth is like water and sugar? Or
Typically, there's
Okay.
several recipes.
Okay.
Some people will do like honey and water. The
interesting.
one that I use that I feel like works the best is typically distilled water, light malt extract, and Caro syrup.
Okay, wow.
Yeah, it's essentially you're making just a nutrient solution. It's typically sugar water.
Yeah.
But yeah, a lot of people use honey. I don't like using honey only because it creates a darker broth, which makes it harder to see if it's clean or not. Like you might have some mold spores that then start growing, and you're not going to notice as well because it's a darker solution.
Okay.
So I do the Caro syrup route just because it produces a clear liquid. And then you can see, is this mycelium or is this mold, All right, so on log cultivation, there's another way that you can do it without all the drilling and tapping, and that's called the totem method. So the totem method is typically achieved by stacking slices of logs and sandwiching sawdust spawn or mycelium-laden cardboard in between the slices. At first, mushrooms might fruit from between the slices, but after full colonization, it can fruit from anywhere on the bark surface, just like if you tap the whole log. And this gives people a much easier way to do it. Maybe you don't have access to tools. I mean, I feel like most people have a drill in the house, but if you don't, this is an easy way where you could just literally slice logs, and it doesn't necessarily have to be a big purchased, spawn. You could literally, say you bought some oyster mushrooms at a market or a store, you could take stem butts and layer it in moist cardboard, and you'll watch the mycelium start colonizing the cardboard. And from there, you just created low budget spawn. So you can take that and put it to your substrate or medium, which is the log. So the next cultivation method we're going to talk about is wood chip bed cultivation. Now for this one specifically, I chose wine cap beds to talk about. Some people are using these methods to do oyster mushrooms and stuff like that. I don't prefer it because oysters are typically a side fruiter. You'll see them fruiting out of the side of the trunk of a tree, or the side of a log. And I feel like in that method of wood chip bed cultivation, it's way too close to the substrate. A lot of times it's going to be very buggy, just less quality in general. So I do these with wood chip beds on our property. So using wood chip mulch and sawdust spawn, you can create beds to produce wine cap mushrooms. The sawdust spawn is purchased or created, much in the same way that any of this is. Essentially, my process for sawdust spawn will be to go from a liquid culture to a grain spawn. And then once that's colonized, I put that to a bag of sterilized sawdust. So when you're creating your bed, you're going to layer spawn with straw, wood chips, and or leaf litter. Typically the Stropharia grows on the forest floor in leaf litter, so it's leaves, any broken twigs, branches, etc. It's not very picky, but I found the best possible chance of success by laying down straw, inoculating the straw layer, topping it with wood chips, and wetting the whole thing. And at that point, as long as you're receiving sufficient rainfall, you don't really need to take care of it. You just need to let it go. And as long as, you'll be harvesting seasonally, which is typically spring and fall, sometimes late summer, depending on how the weather is. But, all you have to do yearly is just feed it more wood chips. That's it. You don't have to reseed. You don't have to get more spawn. You just keep adding wood chips. As long as you keep feeding that mycelium, it'll keep coming back. From whatever trees are, dropping branches or whatever, or all the leaves. So for those, they're not very picky. And it'll seem like they're growing out of the soil, but they're actually colonizing and feeding off of the wood material and then growing up.
What about raised beds? Would you prefer raised beds with those?
You can. Okay, so essentially, I think I have a better picture on the next slide. This is one of the first beds I made, and essentially it's a raised bed, I guess. I bordered it with logs that are also inoculated with other mushroom types. So I have a functional edible landscaping, essentially. So we have some turkey tail, some shiitake, and we have some lion's mane on the back row. And it just gives it a way to, hold in all those wood chips like a raised bed, but it still has connection with the soil. So that way that mycelial network can grow and, actually start benefiting all the plants around it as it starts funneling nutrients and water to, plants that need it the most, or even trees use it to, take care of their kin. Trees, they've realized, can recognize their kin. And so if it has a, child tree nearby that's struggling and not finding the nutrients or the water it needs, it'll use the mycelial network to send it to its kid. And that is fantastic. Not only that, it's the whole, it makes them a fantastic companion gardener too.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of people, that are gardening and not really on the forest thing, they can put wine caps in any of the wood chip mulch that they're doing. If they're doing wood chip mulch for pathways, if they're mulching around, plants that can provide enough shade for them. And then a good thing about wine caps is they can tolerate a lot more direct sunlight than other mushrooms can. So it just makes them fantastic. And they're, exhaling CO2 for the plants. The plants are providing oxygen for the mushrooms. It's a perfect symbiosis, just like we have in the forest. You can take that and create the same thing in your garden.
Are all these species you're talking about, are they all native species to Appalachia?
Yes, yeah. So I have some like oyster varieties that are tropical, and stuff like that. I have like paddy straw mushrooms that are native, in Asia, but not here. But I'm not establishing beds out there and like messing with the ecosystem. Most of the time I'm doing like small batches of those. Most of the tropicals are typically indoors. I wouldn't be able to do a log of, say, pink oysters because they won't make it. They can't make it through our harsh winters, But so most of the time I do those indoors anyway. But, if you find a lot of golden oysters and they weren't here naturally, they essentially spread from people growing them. But now it's getting to the point where, they're established. You can find them pretty prevalently. So for our wood chip beds, you can feed beds annually by adding a layer of wood chips and or leaf litter to the top of the bed. And like I said here, I bordered the beds with inoculated logs to create edible landscaping. It also gives you a variety where depending on what they are, they might fruit at different seasons. So throughout the year, you have a whole buffet of different mushrooms in a small space. So the wood chip paths and mulching can also be inoculated, like I said. And a fun fact that kind of goes with Will's talk on bees. The wine cap mushrooms are the species that sparked the movement by Paul Stamets to create the bee mushroom feeder and its extracts to save the bees. So some people were talking about, what can you do about, deformed wing virus and, dealing with mites. There are actual fungal solutions to this. A lot of the bees' problems and why they're having colony collapse are viral issues. And we have several mushrooms that have huge antiviral compounds. So they've been experimenting with using reishi and turkey tail and chaga, and essentially making like a sugar water solution that has the infusion of the mushroom in it. And because of that, they're boosting the immune system of the bees, which allows them to fight off those viruses, which is actually extending their lifespan to what it's decreased to by deformed wing virus. And as long as you can boost the immunity and they can survive, that's beautiful, you know. Now there are also fungi that they're working on that can actually target varroa mites. And Penn State is somebody that's doing a lot of research on that right now, where, you know, if we can get this to beekeepers, they could literally set out a petri dish in their hive that has this fungi on it, and it'll attack the mites in a natural, organic fashion. And that's huge. I mean, because essentially, if we can save the bees, we can save the world. So essentially, mushrooms can save the world.
All things would agree.
They already really do. I mean, just some of those studies that they have with like the petroleum,
Yeah.
some mushrooms eating plastics.
Yep. There's oyster varieties and a few others that they've been working with, you know, eating plastics, cleaning up oil spills. And it has huge opportunity for bioremediation, and, you know, which I like to call mycoremediation, thanks to Trad Cotter. Because, yeah, we can absolutely use mushrooms to clean up, you know, the runoff, you know, from livestock farms. They've been working with using wine caps specifically to filter out E. coli. And I mean, that's fantastic things, you know. And it's things that nature does anyway, so we might as well,
Harm
know.
stuff.
yeah, exactly. Like, I think, you know, it's been proven that anything that pairs with fungi thrives. So my feeling is, why shouldn't we? You know? So wine caps provide amazing yields of choice gourmets. In that 4x8 bed that I showed you, when it first started, I got like a couple mushrooms, nothing big. I could tell that it wasn't really fully colonized yet. Following spring, I had about 15 pounds of mushrooms in 2 weeks.
Wow.
And I was off of free wood chips that I got from a tree service. Minimally made my own spawn, and I mean that's a huge way to turn free into a whole lot of food. You know, and if we can get more people to do that, I mean that could really save the world. You know, there should be a lot less food insecurity if people have the knowledge to grow their own food like that. You know, and it's given them really good opportunities. Like Trad Cotter did a project in Haiti after, you know, it was absolutely devastated. And there was a whole lot of food insecurity, and they were trying to adapt to their new normal for the next couple of months. And he went down there and he started talking to people and showing them how to grow oyster mushrooms in 5-gallon buckets very cheaply. Off of using agricultural waste or like cane bagasse or, you know, grass on the roadside. They would dry it out, grow the oyster mushrooms on it, and typically within 30 days you can have a harvest with oyster mushrooms. So that took them from having to wait months for relief to being able to relieve themselves in a month, you know. And I've actually had, from inoculation to harvest, I've had some batches of oysters that were done in 18 days. That's about the time it takes to make a radish. So that's huge, you know, with way more nutrient value, protein, etc. You know, and not only that, but every gourmet that I have is also a medicinal. You know, so it's huge, being not only able to grow your own food, but be able to grow your own medicine.
Grow awesome food too.
Yeah, awesome food, exactly. They're choice gourmets for a reason, you know. I think I pretty much already touched on that. Now, so another thing that makes it a great garden companion, they're exceptional at turning wood debris into rich compost. That's their job. They take it, they break it down, and they turn it into fantastic soil. So why not have that added benefit in your garden? And then also just doing, spent blocks, or, you know, I've had like some spawn that went bad, you know, something went wrong in my process and it started growing mold instead. But as long as you see mycelium present, you know, I can still take it out to my compost pile, dump it out there, and my turnaround time of turning compost into usable black gold is drastically shorter ever since I started incorporating mushrooms into it. And whether that's spent blocks or bad spawn or whatever, because it's doing its job, it's taking it all, it's decomposing it. Not only that, but it invites, you know, the beneficial bugs, you know, the worms and stuff like that, and they come up and they do their job. You know, a lot of people say, you know, you need composting worms as opposed to earthworms because earthworms aren't very good vertical eaters. However, if you put something at the top of the pile that they really like mycelium, they're going to go up through that pile, you know. So it just allows them to do their job better. And then wine cap specifically can target and eat nematodes that damage root-bearing vegetables. So that's another huge benefit. Morel mushroom beds. I know everybody loves morels. So the principles of wood chip beds can also be used to create morel beds around the bases of trees that they typically pair with. Some preferred tree species are apple, elm, ash, sycamore, among others. The sawdust spawn can be used to inoculate layers of straw and wood chips, and essentially you're not really colonizing that layer, more or less, like the wine caps will. You're kind of giving a protective layer so that way it can work down into the soil, form sclerotia, and then eventually we'll start pushing up mushrooms. Now the wait time on this is a lot longer than just about anything else. A lot of people kind of shy away from log cultivation because of the 1 to 2 years. I relate morel beds to fruit trees because it typically takes about 3 to 5 years before you're going to see anything from it. But you know, once you have it established, like Paul Stamets says, if you can get a bed established around apple trees, you'll have morel mushrooms for life. That's why a lot of times like abandoned apple orchards and stuff like that are a fantastic place to find morels. And you can kind of simulate that if you try to do it around apple trees or other ones that they prefer. And there's a lot of debate over, you know, oh, I only see on elm, or oh, I only see them on this and that. It's not really about the tree, more or less it's about the microbes in the soil. And it's just typically, that's where they're found, around those trees. So that's why it's no one thing, it's really, are the microbes present in the soil? So another way that a lot of people will try to, you know, propagate morels and other mushrooms is through the spore slurry technique. Mushroom fruiting bodies can be diced or blended into buckets of water to make a spore slurry. This liquid can then be dispersed around your property where you wish for mushrooms to grow. This method works best with soil growers and mycorrhizal fungi. And it's the cheap man, you know, the poor man's way of spreading these spores very simply without having to go through all the processes of making different spawn. You can skip all those steps, and it's not 100%, but it is a good way to propagate it, because essentially you do it in that 5-gallon bucket or whatever of water, and all those spores are released into the water, and it gives you a way to deliver it, you know. Otherwise you're just kind of waiting and hoping that they catch in the wind, land where you want them to, etc. So it gives you a little bit better chances. Leaf mulch compost. So this is actually a picture of one of my compost piles where I had some spent blocks in there, and they started fruiting pink oysters, which shouldn't happen, but it was right when we got all that 80-degree weather, and you know, it was perfect for them. They typically thrive in like 80 to 110 degrees. So I mean, it's a tropical mushroom, but because of that, there's no way that they would make it through our winters. But the main thing is not, you know, it's not another cultivation method per se, but it is an added bonus, you know, because I go to work the greenhouse, I see some mushrooms, and I'm leaving with produce and mushrooms at the same time, so it's a good thing. You can also focus on things like the almond agaricus, which is a compost lover. The almond agaricus is related to the portobello and the white button, which is essentially the same mushroom, just at different stages. But I honestly think that it's much better, because it does have a slight flavor of almond, and it is native here. The cultures that we have, we actually found on our property in our backyard. So it's good to work locally, or you know, with what's already native, because you know it's already acclimated. You know, there are big spawn distributors that I could order almond agaricus spawn from, but why would I do that when I can have one that's right here and it's already acclimated? You know, so essentially you can take leaves and plant trimmings and turn it into compost. They can be inoculated like wood chip beds and used to grow compost-loving mushrooms such as the almond agaricus. Now, much like the wood chip wine cap beds, you just add layers of compostable materials to keep producing mushrooms, or you can take that mycelium-laden compost, put it in other places of your food, forest, or your garden, and establish more beds that way. Mass spawning with sawdust. Okay, so the sawdust is a great spawn because I typically do like a 5-6 pound bag. It's usually about this size, maybe a little bit bigger. And each little grain of sawdust is an inoculation point. So because they're such small particle sizes, you have way more particles. And when you're doing your spawning, each one is an inoculation point that the mycelium will expand in every direction. So the more you have of that, the better chances you have, the faster colonization is. Essentially, you can do the same thing with grain spawn. Typically, the grains are bigger than the sawdust will be, so you're getting a lot less inoculation points. And then also, if you're doing something outdoors, if I just take, grain spawn and cast it out, I have to worry about squirrels and chipmunks and mice and birds and bugs and etc. trying to eat the grain, and they'll typically eat the grain before it has a chance to get established. You don't have that problem so much with sawdust spawn. So you could do soil, leaf litter, compost-loving mushrooms that you can inoculate throughout your wooded property using sawdust spawn. So you could do, wine caps, you could do almond agaricus, etc., and just essentially cast it out and let it do its thing. So all you have to do is break up and sprinkle your sawdust spawn in the areas that you'd like them to establish. Cover with leaf litter, straw, wood chips, anything to give it some protection, and then give it a chance to colonize.
With the sawdust, like, if you're going from grain to sawdust, do you sterilize the sawdust spawn as well?
So you'll sterilize the sawdust before inoculation.
Okay, yeah.
Okay, so essentially I'll put it in a bag like this, and I'll just wrap it, don't seal it, because in the process the bag will inflate if you seal it. So you leave it unsealed, and so this one is sealed. However, I just essentially tuck it underneath, and you can do it as simply as like in a pressure cooker, and so typically you can get like 4 blocks this size in a 23, 24 quart pressure cooker. And so you'll leave them unsealed, stacked like that, and then you're going to seal it up and you're going to cook it at 15 psi, typically for 1.5 hours to 2.5 hours, depending on what you're working. Like the sawdust, the wooden dowels, they need a lot less time because they're less nutritious substrates. However, once you get into like making blocks like this, this is using what they call master mix, and it's half sawdust and half soy hulls. And it just happens to be a fantastic concoction for growing awesome mushrooms. But because of that extra nitrogen from the soy hulls, being a more nutritious substrate, you gotta cook it longer. You absolutely have to. I'll go towards like 2.5 hours at that point, just to make sure that you kill off anything else that can pools. You'll go from grain spawn to sawdust.
And are you doing that like 4 blocks at a time now, or do you have a bigger?
No, yeah, I'm still at that. I just have multiple pressure cookers.
Oh,
Yeah.
oh.
Yeah, absolutely have to. Yeah, no, I'm a very small operation, so I'm not Hernshaw Farms where they have the walk-in autoclaves, which is fantastic. I would love to be there, but I'm not.
Yeah.
But you can do it very simply. It doesn't have to be high-end. You can do it very simply.
I've seen some flow hoods that are.
And the flow hood is probably the biggest hurdle when you're starting to grow mushrooms. It gives you a way to do sterile work, because essentially you have a HEPA filter and a fan. It's blowing, lateral airflow, and that makes you know that in front of that space is sterile because it's pushing through the HEPA filter and it's clean. Typically, if you buy one pre-made, it's about $1,000 to $1,200. You can make one for about $500, but that's a big hurdle, especially if you're starting low budget. So some people are doing like a box fan with a HEPA filter on it, and you can do that much cheaper, and it gives you a much easier way to start. I personally started in an SAB or a still air box. Still air box can be as low budget as a plastic tote with armholes cut out.
Yeah, nice.
That's it.
And I mean, it requires a lot of, spraying of isopropyl alcohol and stuff like that to make sure that that space inside of there is sterile. You want to be working in still air, so that means cutting off the AC or the fan or the heat or whatever's going, and you want to just be as still as possible. And if you, mind your sterile techniques, it's really good, I mean, I did have a lot more contamination with that than I would a flow hood, so I'm glad that I upgraded to the flow hood, but you don't have to. You could do that very minimally. If you have a tote that you could dedicate, at your house, then you could very simply get started today, as opposed to having to save up for the flow hood. You know what I mean? So this is my contact information. If anybody has any questions, comments, concerns, or want to find out anything that I didn't cover, by all means, take down this information, send us an email, hit us up on Facebook, give us a call. We're always available. I could sit here and grow fresh mushrooms all day. I think it's entirely more important to get more people growing mushrooms. I think everybody needs to, have less food insecurity. They need to be able to grow food for themselves, their family. They need to be able to grow their own medicines. I mean, we're in a time where, there's a lot of reasons where we could use this. I think there is huge opportunities for the antivirals that are in funguses to fight stuff like COVID. Now, so personally, wherever you're at on the subject, I don't want to make it political or anything, but I think I had 2 bouts with COVID, and then using the turkey tail mushroom, symptoms were gone in 2 days. That's something that we should be using. Nature provides, we should use it. There's like if you watched Fantastic Fungi, Paul Stamets talks about his mother with stage 4 breast cancer, and he started giving her turkey tail capsules as well as the cancer medication that she was already on, and she lived a lot longer than they gave her. So it's anecdotal at that point, I guess, like was it the turkey tail, was it the, medicines, or was it both? But I think it gave her a better chance for success, and I think that's a beautiful thing.
Have you ever tried like log inoculation just with by placing them next to each other, like up?
Okay, so here's the story. So when I had the totem method up, I had a log that had some golden enoki growing on it. I used that log because if you notice, there were no holes in it. It wasn't sliced.
Yeah.
That was something that was nearby. After I felled the tree, I had a bunch of smaller branches that weren't really worth selling. I was going to get around to them, doing them for personal use later, but I never got around to it. Way too overwhelmed. It was nearby my totem stacks, and the totem stack, grew out. I missed the first batch, dropped spores, and inoculated those logs for me.
Okay, cool. That's great. Yeah, I've heard of the people, I think like in Japan particularly, traditionally doing that with the shiitake.
Yep.
Like stacking fresh logs in the other inoculated
Yep.
logs.
Yeah, and you can get free, without
then you
having
don't
to
even
do
have
the
to do
additional
it.
labor.
Yeah.
You don't have to do the spawn.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
But I see
Now-
that's after a fruiting and they drop the spawn. That's not
Right.
necessarily like mycelium jumping into the next
Right,
log.
yeah, more or less it's probably some went to the point of spore drop, the spores got onto those logs, because they probably had it right there,
Okay.
and it gave them the best chance for success. But yeah, it's absolutely possible. That's what it does in nature anyway.
Right, yeah.
Fight! No, I'm just kidding.
You mentioned there were different types of logs that were best suited for certain mushrooms. Can you talk about those?
So, it's a grocery list. However, every mushroom has its preferences, typically. Now, I deal mainly with woodland mushrooms, typically wood-based as opposed to soil growers or manure lovers, etc. And typically in the world of woodland mushrooms, white oak is king. If you have white oak that you can take down and in focus, you can grow just about anything in my 30+ strain library. Yes, yeah, no, I have a strain library. So essentially, like when I first started out and I was talking about, starting with the liquid cultures, I would get a syringe, I would take it, and I would make a mother culture immediately off of everything. And I've done that with, liquid cultures, I've done that with tissue biopsies of wild clones, etc. And in doing that, you set yourself up for success, because you could have that one syringe, you could make 5 jars, and you could make 5 blocks out of that, and you can grow it out and happy fun time. But when that's done, then you gotta order more. So why? Be self-sustainable, you know?
Right.
And I mean, forest farmers are self-sustainable people. That's what we're all going for anyway. So I think you should take everything, make a mother of it, and be self-sustainable.
What would you say, like, what are you producing a month, would you say, for your indoor?
It's hard. Okay, so it was kind of a slow creep over the past few years. Our first step was to start at one market and see how we did. The first year was an absolute blessing, but there was no way possible I could produce enough. As soon as I started, I would start small and grow up more, and week after week I was selling out within 2 hours. I couldn't even make it the whole time at market, because once they found out there was mushrooms, they were telling other people, or other people would start seeing it on Facebook or whatever, and it's to the point where I haven't found my limit yet. So from year 1 to year 2, I doubled production, because I was like, I can't do enough. I'm doing one 4x8 tent inside. Let me do another. So I did another. It wasn't enough. From year 2 to year 3, I've quadrupled production from 2 to 3. Still not enough. And that's why I think it's super important to get other people growing.
Yeah, I noticed in my area that you're hard pressed to find anything like that.
Absolutely, yeah. And it's like that a lot of places, because there's a huge market for it. For protein, meat alternatives.
Yeah.
Like I have, some people that didn't start vegan, but they are now. They miss, things like scallops. You can take king oyster mushrooms, which grow a nice thick stem, slice coins, sear on both sides, treat it just like you would a scallop, and you have vegan scallops.
And it's right, yeah,
don't get me wrong, I love Impossible Burgers, I love Morningstar Farm stuff, but nobody's doing vegan scallops.
They make great ceviche too. It comes out like scallop ceviche.
Yeah?
Yeah,
Okay.
spread the word.
As far as the king oyster, or you mean there's companies that are making it?
No, King Oyster makes
Right.
good ceviche.
Oh, absolutely, yeah, 100%. Not only that, it's very versatile. You can, slice it into strips and do, bacon alternative.
Yeah.
It's fantastic for mushroom jerky, which if you haven't tried mushroom jerky, it's absolutely fantastic. I'd say probably the best mushroom jerky is lion's mane.
Ooh, that's fancy mushroom jerky.
It is and it isn't. To me, it's an everyday thing. And to you, it can be an everyday thing. You just have to start growing it.
So would you say you're in the 100-pound range a month, roughly, or guesstimations?
About that. About that, yeah.
Like this year or that?
This year.
This year.
Yeah,
This year.
absolutely. Yeah, no, so I'd say first year I was maybe doing 5 pounds a week at best. And then I would have a lot of times where it'd be lean times because, I didn't get in and do that weekly work, so everything went on a rest period. Typically when you have a block, it'll flush, you'll harvest, and then it typically goes on a 2-week rest, where it'll rest and not do anything, and then it'll push out another flush. So if I wasn't doing my work and I wasn't timing it right, then there was times, there were lean times, of course. But now, I would say I'm about 100 pounds a month, and that's done very minimally. That's
indoor.
That's just my indoor for the most part. Yeah, because everything outdoor I just consider an added bonus. So if I have a 15-pound wine cap flush that I wasn't planning on, awesome.
Yeah, here's to the market. Here's
to the market. Yeah, great for the market, and whatever doesn't sell at market, there's restaurants and stores that are chomping at the bit for it.
Is this is this your this is you, this is what you do?
This is it.
This is your
Yes.
This is you. How
Correct.
You make your living.
Yes, this was my way to get out of the restaurant industry. So before this, I was a chef for a long time. I've worked at pretty notable places even here. However, it was entirely too demanding. 18-hour days, very little pay. They don't care if you have a family. They don't care if there's a holiday. They don't care if you're sick. Honestly, the whole work culture now, which I'm sure most of you know, if I died today, I'd be replaced by next week. So why am I giving my all to a place that doesn't care about me? And not only that, but at the same time, my wife was working on finishing her bachelor's degree in education and doing her student teaching hours, and now she's going to be applying to local schools to be a teacher. And it gave me a way to work from home, spend more time with my family. I homeschool my kid, so it just gives me a way to do all the things that I wanted to do and not be attached to some business that didn't care about me.
And that's what we were discussing before, like when I was telling you about my friend Josh, like that's what he's ideally looking for. So I'm looking to facilitate that between both of us.
Yeah.
But I want to be able to allow him to have that access for funds to be able to live,
Yeah.
survive.
Absolutely.
Not just survive,
Right,
thrive.
right.
I want to.
Right. I'm not gonna tell you it's easy.
Right.
'Cause
Oh
it's
no,
not.
oh no.
Because it's not. There's been several lean times.
Yeah.
The horrible time is during the winter.
Yeah.
Like if there's no active farmers markets, I can still produce, but the other farmers can't. So that's when I had to reroute away from the markets, start focusing on restaurants and stores, stuff like that over the winter.